So I would like to welcome you to the CoSA-NARA webinar. Today is April 9th, and today's topic is MPLP, More Product, Less Process, Projects at the National Archives at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And I'd like to turn the microphone over for just a minute to Meg Phillips, who is the External Affairs Liaison with the National Archives and Records Administration. Meg, would you like to offer a welcome?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. So hi, everybody. On behalf of the National Archives, welcome to everyone to this edition of our series of joint NARA-CoSA webinars, where we drill down on a selected aspect of archival practice by highlighting kind of parallel work at the National Archives and at State Archives. This is a very special pandemic edition of the series, and I think it's full to capacity because so many of us are working from home. So again, on behalf of NARA, I want to share all of our best wishes for the health and safety of you and all of your families and everybody at your archives. And now I'll pass it over to Barbara.
Thanks, Meg. We appreciate you being here. We're also very grateful to have the National Archives and Records Administration partner with the Council of State Archivists. I'm Barbara T., the Executive Director of CoSA, and as Meg said, we're very happy to have so many of you here today. I think this is our first at-capacity webinar in quite a long time, probably because so many people are searching for continuing education to do online, and we're very happy that you're here with us today, and grateful that this partnership with NARA allows us to talk about something in the State Archives and in the National Archives that highlights archives and records management for in our institutions. And today, you'll be hearing more about the more product, less process, which I think we all probably need to do that no matter what we're doing, like evaluate what we're doing and if we're doing it the best way. But CoSA and NARA are committed to carrying on this webinar series for the rest of the year. If we are in quarantine for a long time, we have another webinar coming up in June. CoSA also has member webinars that are labeled member webinars, but you're very welcome to attend those as well. I think we'll have some links to those at the end of the webinar, and then we also have a series of electronic records webinars that everyone is welcome to attend to. So we're happy to have you here and so glad to see so many of you are healthy at home. So thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Lisa.
Thanks, Barbara. Well, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. First, we'll have Michael Moore. Michael has been at the National Archives since 2001. He's currently the Chief of Staff for the Deputy for Operations in the Office of Research Services and the Director of NARA's Affiliated Archives Program. He also serves as the program owner for the Research Services Processing Program and is acting co-director for the Field Records Division. Prior to joining NARA, he was the archivist for the Texas General Land Office, a state agency. He has a Master of Library and Information Science from the University of Texas with a concentration in archival enterprise and a Master's of Arts in Political Science from Texas State University. Our second presenter today will be Abbie Norderhaug. Abbie is the Assistant State Archivist at the Wisconsin Historical Society. She has been in this role since 2016 and oversees the collection of state and local government records and the cataloging of print and electronic state publications. Prior to this role, Abbie spent 8 years as the Wisconsin Historical Society's Public Records Accessioner. Abbie has a Master's of Library Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison High School. When she's not working, she enjoys spending time with her family, gardening, and being outdoors. So I'm obviously not Carrie Martin. Carrie couldn't be with us. So at this point, I think we'll turn this over to, well, first we'll let you know what we're doing today. We've had our welcome, and then we're going to hear from Michael first with processing MPLP at National Archives. Then we'll hear from Abbie with those similar projects at Wisconsin Historical Society. We will have a question and answer segment at the end. So if you do have questions, as you think about them, type them into chat, and we'll capture them and ask those questions at the end, and then we'll have a few announcements. So now let's go ahead and we'll turn it over to Michael. and hear about MPLP at the National Archives.
Thank you. So glad to be here with you all to talk about this. So today I'm going to be telling you about what we've done at the National Archives to reshape how we do processing. And to a large degree, that work has incorporated in MPLP principles. It's been a long journey. It's hard to believe now that our work on changing processing practices at NARA started about 13 years ago. In 2007, switch slides here. Whoops, going the wrong way. In 2007, NARA was concerned about the growing processing backlog that we faced, and we had an OIG audit of textual records processing, which called for quite substantial changes in how we did things to take care of the backlog. At the time, NARA's non-presidential library holdings were split between two separate offices. There was the Office of Record Services for Washington College Park and the Office of Regional Record Services, which administered field locations. And those offices pursued separate but similar strategies initially to satisfy the audit recommendations. So I first started working on this in 2008 when I was part of the Office of Regional Record Services. But those two offices were merged later as part of reorganization around 2011. And following that, my colleague Ann Cummings and I were asked to try to find a way forward and keep working on that process. So I do want to be clear that much of what I'm talking about today is about processing non-presidential library holdings. Since presidential libraries are a separate office at NARA, and they do have some different requirements, although we've worked on this in parallel and come up with some similar practices. We have a lot of challenges at NARA, and it's quite complicated for processing because of the scale. The most important fact was that we had a large and growing backlog of records to process. It was estimated at the time that we would need several times the number of staff just to keep the backlog from growing further, assuming no other changes were made to how we processed. And to put that into perspective, NARA holdings were, and of course still are, enormous. The volume of non-presidential library holdings in 2010, 10 years ago, was 4,442,859 cubic feet. And the total number of series that we had, the total number of accession series, were 288,771. So it's a lot. 10 years ago, we had processed 76.31% of the holdings, which isn't too bad. However, most of the low-hanging fruit of the backlog had been done, and the rate of progress was very slow. Though we were keeping up with the new accessions, the backlog was shrinking at less than about 1% per year. In 2010, we had 107 FTE processing records in 16 separate custodial units in different geographic locations. There's 4 in the DC area, 4 units there, and 12 small field units located around the country. So processing was conducted separately and differently by a lot of different custodial units. There was no standard approach that was in place. In addition to that, new systems were implemented in the 2000s for description and managing holdings at NARA. And while these were significant new tools for intellectual and physical control, they represented a major change and complication in how records were processed, and they introduced a lot of new steps and requirements that needed to be accommodated. So by 2010, for a variety of reasons, there were limitations on our ability to increase the number of processing staff. And that meant that we couldn't really, as I think of it, buy our way out of the backlog by just hiring more people. We really had to recognize that we would never have enough staff to keep up with processing at the current rate. So really reducing the processing backlog could only come from changes in how we processed. So as we looked at our processing practices, we observed several things. Generally, custodial units were following a kind of one-size-fits-all processing. all records were processed in pretty much the same way. Processing was considered complete once you carried out 3 or 4 standard actions, traditional actions like arrangement, description, and holdings maintenance. We tended to follow a model of perfection, like so many organizations, which was laudable in certain ways. The goal was to provide the very best we could at arrangement, description, and holdings maintenance, but it was very time-consuming. We lacked a systematic process for planning, tracking, or evaluating actions. Different units had administrative ways to keep track of and plan processing, but again, they differed across the many different units that were doing processing. Definitions of processing were not consistent, and generally they were somewhat outdated. It was clear that different people meant different things when they used the word processing. So it was kind of a basic concern, but important to be addressed. There was no criteria for what was essential. Beyond the traditional arrangement, description, and holdings maintenance, there were different and inconsistent versions of other actions that might be needed at NARA involving things like access restrictions and physical controls and verification of disposition and all the many kinds of things that we were dealing with. So when Ann and I started working on this project, we approached it from a practical, kind of a cost-benefit perspective, looking for efficiencies that we could find. And it was clear to us that the critique of traditional processing that we found in the MPLP approach was really a valuable perspective for thinking about this. And it guided us to an important insight that completely changed how we viewed processing. That insight was simply that it was likely that not all NARA's records were equal in terms of processing needs. So wouldn't we be a lot more efficient if we only did what was truly necessary when it was needed? And wouldn't it help if there were criteria to guide processing actions to do that? So that raised several other questions. What was it we were trying to accomplish by processing in the first place? What were our objectives? What was the degree or level of actions that was needed in order to accomplish our objectives? And so on. In other words, the MPLP perspective led us to begin questioning all of our built-in assumptions and the consequences of our current processing model, like particular types of holdings maintenance practices. So it caused us to ask, what would it take to be more deliberate and thoughtful about all of these things? So in 2014, Ann Cummings and I presented NARA senior management with a white paper containing our assessment of analog processing at NARA and proposed a new model. What we called for incorporated several principles. Aimed to provide access to all holdings, and this got to one of the core MPLP assessments that some access is better than no access, and big backlogs means that a large percentage of the holdings is going to be inaccessible. Always look for the golden minimum, the least we can do to get the job done in a way that's adequate to user needs, both now and in the future. And we borrowed this idea and the phrase from our colleagues in the University of California system who put out system-wide guidelines where they used this concept, because we felt that this idea of a golden minimum really conveyed what we were trying to accomplish. We were concerned that NARA was following a model of perfection, especially in regards to things like holdings maintenance, beyond what was truly necessary. But even with the golden minimum, processing work beyond the minimum can be justifiable in some cases, but we needed clear criteria to guide us for deciding when that should happen. And then another principle was to aim to analyze the work necessary for every series, and to be flexible in the amount of work that was applied. So one-size-fits-all thinking had been a characteristic of the way that processing had been done, and it ignored some fundamental differences among records. Past archival practices often led to describing records without regard to variations in use, users, or the significance of records. And that requires a major investment of resources with no clear, consistent benefit, and of course leads to big backlogs. And the last principle was to implement a systematic and meaningful process for planning, tracking, or evaluating processing actions. We felt we needed to measure what was going on and to make comparisons, to identify processing rates, and in other words, to be kind of data-driven to ensure that processing was being carried out efficiently. The model we proposed had 5 essential ingredients: a single definition of processing, and as I mentioned, we discovered that you could ask different people what processing was and get different answers, so we felt we clearly needed everyone to be on the same page about what processing was and what it consisted of so we could talk about it. Different levels of processing. Another useful concept that we adopted from MPLP was the idea of setting the minimum actions needed, but holding the door open to do more in specific instances. By defining different levels, we felt that we could be more deliberate and thoughtful about allocating resources to more in-depth processing projects when that was merited. We called for implementing methods for assessment, planning, and tracking. So we advocated for an approach that would start with evaluating records and systematically planning actions based on those evaluations. Sort of a checklist then that would need to be completed before records could be considered processed. And while this step in itself would take some time, some additional time, the result we felt should be a more efficient process and one that would leave no question about what we were trying to accomplish when we did processing. We also incorporated the idea of basing actions on the characteristics of the records and balancing efficiency and risk. So we felt that we should aim for a balance between plans for processing actions, the implications that might have for reference actions, and the access needs of users, and ask the question, well, what is the minimum level necessary to provide access? So letting the records and NARA objectives drive the actions rather than just doing the same actions all the time for all records. So in the white paper, we proposed a new model that would substitute that would create a flexible, goal-oriented approach for what we felt had been unintentionally probably, but certainly a kind of a rigid processing by rote. So this model put the primary focus on the records and users, not the actions. So basically shifted the question of what constitutes meaningful success in processing from what did we do to what did we accomplish. So that was really key to kind of the philosophical underpinnings of this whole rethinking of processing. And lastly, at the very core of all this was the inclusion of standards, the creation of standards that indicated what the minimum goal of processing was. What was it that we were trying to achieve? So in 2016, our recommendations were accepted, and following input from the presidential libraries, new guidelines were issued by NARA's Chief Operating Officer, which defined processing for analog records, established 2 levels of processing, and created 8 standards for basic processing to meet. And I excerpted the statements about policy and definition for you. I'm not going to read through this, but it included a policy statement about why we process records, what we're trying to accomplish, and then defined what processing is. And again, putting the emphasis on what we're trying to accomplish in processing. The 2 levels of processing that were established is basic processing and augmented processing. The basic processing is simply the minimal acceptable level of processing that we expect all records to meet. So it sets up the standards for physical and intellectual control that we feel are essential, then augmented processing would be any work that's done beyond that minimal basic level and is prompted by specific needs or what we're trying to accomplish in a specific instance, which may be driven by the significance of the records. And again, at the core of all this were standards. So the policy established eight standards and gave the definitions for these. These were the standards that must be met in order for records to be considered processed at the basic level. And the intent was that the records would be evaluated when they came in the door against these standards, and then work would be planned accordingly. Realizing that in some cases, the standards may already be met when the records come in the door. There's certain things information that we may have, and we may be able to satisfy those standards right away. Or in the case of our backlog records, things may have already been done at some point in the history of those records. And we could check that box off. Each standard is intended to meet some specific need, what we're trying to accomplish, and specifies what the minimum expectation is. For instance, the standard for records housing specifies that materials are housed in boxes sufficiently sturdy to allow safe handling and transportation between the storage areas and the research room. So reboxing or refoldering would not be an automatic process, but based on evaluation of the records to see where they're at. And then intent, even in the policy, was that this would be further specified. So once the policy was adopted, Ann and I led a team to create a processing manual for research services, which contained the procedures needed to guide staff in evaluating the records and applying standards for planning the work, as well as creating a method for documenting. The first processing manual was introduced in 2017. The main components of the manual are on the slide. Basically assessment, how to apply basic standards, quality control, what is augmented processing, and how to document processing. And I included the current table of contents from the current version of our processing manual, so you can see what we include now. The core of the manual really is how to apply the standards to meet basic processing. For each standard, there's a purpose, an explanation of the standard, and any additional guidance. And I apologize, I really meant to include a slide that showed an excerpt of that for you so you could see how that works in the manual, but somehow the slide got left out. So I'll try to explain what it looks like. There's specific instructions provided on how to evaluate whether actions are needed or not. And it's put in the context of what requires no further action if particular conditions are true, or what requires further actions if certain conditions are true. And the intent was to be as clear as we could about how staff would be expected to evaluate the records, and then how that would lead them to think in terms of doing certain actions. So to give you an example, for holdings maintenance, there's a standard for condition of records housing. The purpose is to ensure records are adequately housed. The standard, which I mentioned before, was that records would be housed sufficiently to allow safe storage, handling, and transport. But in the manual, it includes additional guidance. It steers staff to Appendix 2, which is a guidance for paper media holdings maintenance during basic processing, and points out that additional holdings maintenance actions during basic processing may be needed in order to meet other standards, such as arrangement or access restrictions. And that's addressed under those standards. So where it says record housing meets the standards and records can be safely stored and provided to researchers, if that condition is met, then it requires no further action. It explains that if textual records are not in folders within boxes and there's no discernible arrangement, then that would require further action. Or if all or some of the records are in damaged folders that don't allow access and are expected to receive high use, then it would require further action. And the further basic processing action is indicated as replacing or adding folders as appropriate and only as needed. So there's fairly specific guidance about each of these standards. Since 2017, when we issued the original manual, we've been making various improvements. We keep adjusting. It's an annual process for us. We request feedback from staff that are using the manual and making sure that there's clarity about it and asking for suggestions for improvements to the manual. And so we continue to update it also in response to other input, whether from senior management or other people that are stakeholders in this process. We've significantly improved quality control procedures as a result and beefed up how that process works so that there's verification built into the process about how these standards are being accomplished and met. The section on augmented processing has been greatly improved to provide better guidance on what it is and when it's done. We've made improvements to the assessment process. It was originally a form. It's now part of our holdings management system, integrated into a system that staff use to physically control the holdings. This year, new training on the assessment process is being developed and will be rolled out to provide further guidance to staff on using that process. We've also conducted processing rate studies to see how that's going, what our processing rates are. It's been difficult because of the number of variables that affect our data, so we still continue to try to refine that data. We found that we've been averaging between about 1.5 and 2.5 cubic feet per hour, and have set a goal for 2.5 cubic feet per hour. I'd be very interested to learn about what kinds of processing rates state archives are looking for, since that would be somewhat comparable to the kinds of records that we process, and see if you're getting similar rates or how things are going for other people. It has been difficult, as I mentioned, trying to get good measurements, and so we need to keep trying to refine that data. Another change we've made is that originally the manual was specific to analog textual records. Last year we broadened it to include special media. Electronic records were addressed in a separate processing manual, but this year we're going to begin looking at how to merge that processing manual with the analog processing manual to create a single manual. So we will continue to be refining our processing processes. It's never done. So results, have we succeeded? Well, probably we need more time to really evaluate how successful we've been. But so far, it looks like after implementing these changes 3.5 years ago, most of the indicators suggest we're farther along than we would have been otherwise. Since 2016, we've seen an increase of 12.36 percentage points in what's processed. Moreover, it's clear that the way we do processing is more deliberate, more goal-oriented, and more efficient. Despite having fewer staff for processing today than in 2016, we're still able to keep up with new accessions, and we continue to reduce the backlog at a faster rate than we used to. So the indicators do point that it's working. We feel pretty good about how the direction is going. So that's pretty much it for my part. Thank you.
Okay, next we'll hear from Abbie. Abbie, there you go.
Yep. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Abbie Norderhaug, and thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to talk to you about the experience we had at the Wisconsin Historical Society, where we used MPLP techniques to prepare to move collections to our new State Archive Preservation Storage Facility. The Wisconsin Historical Society is an independent state agency that serves as the State of Wisconsin State Archive. We are also the North American History Library for the UW-Madison, and we have a manuscript collection in addition to our state government records collection. The State Archives at the Historical Society collects records from over 50 state agencies, 71 of the state's 72 counties, and thousands of municipalities. Annually, we take in about 1,000 cubic feet of public records per year, and handling this content are 2 full-time staff members, one who works with state government records and one who works with local government records. They are able to use a team of work study students and part-time staff to assist with some of the accessioning work on this material. Those full-time staff members, in addition to accessioning, are responsible for providing records management advice and training to state agencies and local government units, traveling for field appraisals, and other archival work. So given the small staff size, using an MPLP style approach is the only way to make sure that our public records collections are accessible in a reasonable time frame. The Wisconsin Historical Society has been accepting public records since at least 1907. So as you can imagine, in the intervening years, we've had a number of different processing styles. The earliest records in our collection are what we think of as fully processed. The material's arranged, it's labeled in folders and boxes, and it has container lists with detailed descriptions and scope and content notes. From this detailed treatment, collections move to a status where they appear processed. However, rather than creating finding aids, detailed information about content was added onto box labels. As you might imagine, this works great if you have time to go into the stacks and read labels, but it's not very patron-friendly. In the 1960s, the WHS received a building addition that was almost entirely stack space. And as you might guess, when something like this happens, staff began collecting sort of wildly. We had excessive collecting in both our state government record collections and our manuscript collections. So the project I'm going to talk about here mostly deals with the records that we took in between the 1960s and the 1980s, because that's a period of time when our collecting far outpaced what our collections management staff could handle. So the majority of those collections that we brought in were shelved with the idea that they would be fully processed someday. And staff assumed that traditional processing would deal with this backlog. By the early 1990s, however, WHS staff realized that we needed a better system to deal with incoming records. Around the same time, the first iteration of the storage building that we moved our collections to was first discussed. And just as a spoiler alert, it would take 30 more years for that building to come to fruition. So I have on screen here the WHS minimal accessioning standards. These were developed in the early 1990s, and staff oral tradition says that they were developed in response to an online catalog. The feeling was that with an online catalog, things that had been hidden were now going to be more visible to the public, and if they were going to be visible to the public was going to want to use them. So we can develop these minimal accessioning standards, and the document that's on the screen compares our accessioning standards to what we considered our full processing standard. So you can see that we've taken some of the processing steps and basically said we're not going to be able to do those if we're going to meet our minimal accessioning standards. One thing that's important to note is that although we developed these in the early 90s, we do use different types of standards for different types of collections. So, for example, the majority of our local government records collections are actually not treated in this way. They are treated in a way much more similar to kind of traditional full processing. And then certain state records collections that include things like PII or confidential information, we also don't consider candidates for these minimal accessioning standards. The state records collections that have a lot of PII or confidential information are something that I sort of describe as MPLP plus, meaning we selectively give more attention to the areas of those collections that have that information we're concerned about. And then other parts of the collection are processed using these minimal standards. So just continuing through our minimal accessioning standards, at the description level, we rarely assign series and subseries to public records collections unless the collection is particularly large or has a lot of distinct pieces. Each folder gets listed on a container list by folder title only. For many years, we didn't include dates. We didn't even go into folders to look for dates for these folders. But starting around 2013, we began requiring that every folder that's listed on a container list also has a date associated with it. And then items have been treated differently throughout sort of the evolution of our minimal accessioning standards. At one point, they were simply described by saying that there's X number of tapes, films, or et cetera, and more of a narrative style. As we started getting ready to move collections, so starting around 2010, we began assigning individual call numbers to items and listing individual titles within container lists. And then finally, the preservation steps. The preservation area is one of those areas where even things that get that MPLP plus treatment still fall back to the minimal standards. We rarely refolder public records collections, and we never remove metal fasteners with the exception of binder clips. And one thing I learned recently is if you want to be very popular with your finance team, you can give them the binder clips you remove from your collections. I've never seen the person who handles our contracts so happy as when I gave her records on her full of binder clips. So if you need to make friends with people in finance, try handing them your binder clips. And when we talk about the photocopying of newsprint or deteriorating material, again, that's not something we routinely do either. We have occasionally made exceptions to that with our public records collections, but those exceptions are few and far between. So our MOVE project was to move 30,000 feet of public record material. And we determined several things early on in this project. The first was that we weren't going to move anything that didn't have a description. So we knew that we were going to be moving more than 50% of our material off-site. And in order to avoid wear and tear on our collections, wear and tear on our staff, we knew that any material that was moved off-site needed to be described so that people using the catalog and using our finding aids would be able to decide if they wanted a box based on that information. We were trying to avoid having to bring over multiple boxes for people who are going on a fishing expedition that could have been prevented through description work on the part of archive staff. Every record series in the WHS catalog gets a series level description, which is essentially a paragraph or two which describes the series, and they're higher level and based on record schedule. So we determined that each accession of a larger series would get its own paragraph length abstract describing its content. These accession level descriptions allowed us to be very specific about what is included in each accession. We also determined that for any collection that's more than one box, it needed to list both box and folder level details on a container list that would be marked up into EAD. We also determined, like I mentioned earlier, that if a collection had multiple formats, so audio, video, photos, all of that material also needed to be accounted for on a container list and described. We determined that we were not going to move any collections that we couldn't bring up to these standards. So once we determined what standards we wanted to bring our collections to, we had to determine which collections that these would apply to. So we looked at several different things. The first thing that we looked at was the use pattern of a collection. If our call slips reflected that a collection had been paged frequently, we determined that we weren't going to move it. Ironically, this meant that some of our most frequently used collections still have a lower level of description than collections that were moved off-site because they were not worked on as part of this project. The next thing that we decided that if a collection was going to move, we were going to move the entire collection. So that meant that if part of a series was high use and another part was not, that high use would prevent the entire series from moving. Then we started looking for large collections of similar content type because we felt that these would be easiest to apply our minimal accessioning standards to. So we looked for things like runs of controlled correspondence that tended to be arranged by control number or alphabetically, or long runs of subject files. The thing we had to be careful of with subject files is we were then committing to listing every single folder in our container list. So we had to make sure that the subject file series were big, but not necessarily too big. And then we thought about location of material. And this was a little tough to balance with some of our other principles. But for example, we had a leased storage area, and we knew that that building needed to be vacated so that we could stop paying rent on it. So all collections in that building were determined to be prepped to move rather than sort of evaluated individually based on their content and how well they fit with some of our other ideas. And then we thought about appraisal because ultimately this was a backlog project which addressed material that was acquired before we implemented our minimal accessioning standards. So during the period of the project, the WHS Appraisal Committee met more regularly than it had in the past and discussed a number of public records accessions. The goals of these appraisals were not to deaccession collections, but rather to discuss and evaluate our collections and make sure we were following our collecting plans. Most of the material the committee discussed was retained, but we usually were able to come up with some specific weeding plans. Once we determined that a collection was going to be moved, we used a collection task list that you can see on your screen here to identify what work needed to be done on the collection, which accessions it needed to be happened to, and then there's a column on the right side that could be used as a checklist to track the work that had been done. The benefit of using these collection task lists as we evaluated collections for MPLP and got them ready to move was that all the work a potential collection might need was summarized. So that way, staff could review collections, determine the work necessary, and then assign collections to be worked on to appropriate project staff. Because the collection size varied so greatly and we had a variety of part-time staff, we used these sheets as a way to manage which staff members worked on which types of collections. The benefit of using a task list like this with our MPLP work was it allowed the staff running the project a uniform way to communicate with project staff and allowed for accountability with part-time staff who are processing collections. So the outcomes of our project were first, improve catalog records. The catalog record you see on the screen here is for 183 cubic feet, which is described in 12 separate accessions. At the top of the screen on the right-hand side, and it's kind of lightly pink colored, you can see a lengthy abstract level description that I mentioned earlier. You can also see that the physical details include counts of other formats, and each collection that we worked on ended up with a catalog record that looked similar to this. The next outcome were EAD finding aids for every collection that moved. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the way that each unique accession was handled. Each of these parts take the user to a box and folder list specific to only that accession. This allows our users to still access materials with the individual unit that it came in with. Across the top of the page, you can also see a full text printable view, which is really helpful when you're helping people in a reference situation because you can expand and search across all of the accessions in an entire series. And then another outcome is the fact that this process is still ongoing. We were able to make sure that all of our incoming accessions that are more than one box are still receiving our minimal accessioning standards and get entered into EAD after they are accessioned. Currently, since we're all working remotely, we also now have staff that are using archive space to continue marking up container lists of the collections that we didn't move. So like I mentioned, some of our more heavily used collections didn't get this MPLP treatment, but they may have had a list in Word or a list that has not yet been marked up into EAD, but we're using this time when staff is working at home to catch up on some of that work. And then, of course, we found collections that we moved with a less than ideal container list, and even one or two, unfortunately, that we missed and went to our new facility without any improved access. So we've been able to track those, and we can work those into our workflows and make sure that everything that's at our new building ends up with this same level of description. So we learned a couple lessons along the way. Overall, we spent about 5 years using these minimal standards and MPLP approaches to getting our collections ready to move off-site. So overall, we learned that the project worked as it would, and by planning up front about what collections were appropriate candidates for MPLP, we were able to make this whole process work. There were times when we'd pull a collection that we thought was a great MPLP candidate, open the boxes and take a look, and determine that more work was needed than we'd be able to do in the course of this project. In those instances, we were able to either make a choice that the collection should move and we would do the extra work necessary, or we were able to, because we weren't moving everything, temporarily kind of keep a list and set it aside until later in the project when we had more time. Another thing we worked, and I included a screenshot of a container list that reflects this, is arranging things intellectually rather than physically. Given the number of collections we looked at, there were times when space or staff constraints made it impossible to physically rearrange a collection. In these instances, we determined that rather than move around material, we'd represent its correct location on a finding aid, but keep the boxes numerically out of order. So the list on the screen shows this. This is one of those things that I think worked really well and allowed us to move through collections quickly, but it does require more staff intervention when you are assisting a patron with reference use, because you have to point out that this collection goes from box 9, folder 6 to box 44, folder 6, which can be confusing as you're helping people page collections. Another thing that worked for us is recognizing that although we were using our minimal standards, we could still combine accessions when it made sense. So there'd be times when we'd be working on a collection and notice that it was the first half of the alpha run and the second half of the alpha run was in a different accession, and we would just combine those. So that really helped us clean up our collections, and it helped us make more intellectual sense of things for our users. Another lesson learned of something that worked, which seems a little silly, is an accession number stamp. This is, I think, probably one of the staff's favorite outcomes of this entire project. We write a 7-digit accession number on all folders, so we ordered a custom stamp that we could stamp that accession number on and saved considerable staff time by not making people write those numbers anymore. And then another lesson of what worked was the tracking material. So using that template I showed you earlier so that we could track our staff work, using cataloging forms, and really taking a lot of the guesswork out of the process, really standardizing the material that our staff was producing. And of course, we learned lessons of what didn't work. One of the things that we tried, because we did some time studies and determined that it would save time for us, was not writing folder numbers on the folders. So we wouldn't put box and folder numbers on. We did some time studies, and we found that it took about 15 minutes per box to add a box and folder number. So processing staff decided that we'd save ourselves 15 minutes and leave that off. However, it turns out that this makes the job of public services staff much more difficult because they weren't able to go to a box and pull a folder that they needed. So we determined that it probably wasn't worth saving 15 minutes if it was going to create long-term reference issues to save those 15 minutes. So we now went back to writing box and folder numbers on everything. Another thing we tried that didn't work was splitting up series between staff and having staff work on individual sessions separately. Staff simply just didn't like that approach. It made them feel a bit disconnected from the material they were working on, and it took away some of those advantages of being able to occasionally combine material. And then a third lesson learned of what didn't work was using the descriptions written on boxes. We decided to trust our past staff members and copy information that was written on boxes into EAD directly. And we didn't bother going in and checking. And unfortunately, in many cases, that's okay, but we're now in a situation where, because our content is offsite, if there is a slight problem with some of that material, we end up having to page quite a few boxes to try to get to the bottom of what's going on. And then we had a few overall lessons to our project. The first one is obviously not all collections can be described this way. We found things as we were working through it that really needed more attention. Collections that are particularly complex weren't good candidates, or collections with PII and confidential information. The second one was a bit of a surprise, but it really shouldn't have been. It turns out that if you spend 5 years improving the descriptive information about your material, people will use that improved description and ask to use collections. So we ended up paging a much higher percentage of collections from our offsite facility than we anticipated we would, largely because now that everything is cataloged and has a box and folder list, people are able to see what we have and are wanting to access it. So it was a surprise, but it's been a great lesson to see that people really appreciate the material that we do have. The third lesson we learned was an old saying from a longtime staff member. She always warned us to never open a box in the stacks because you'd be responsible for taking care of what you discovered. And during the course of this project, it turns out she was right. I opened many boxes that I wanted to just shut and put back on the shelf. There was an entire box of shorthand stenographer notepads that was particularly memorable. But like she said, because we opened it, we were then responsible for figuring out how to handle it. So we used this opportunity to really push through and sort of evaluate collections and make sure that we were keeping good material and making it available in a good way. Another thing that we've learned throughout this process is we decided that we would move entire collections, but it turns out that that's not really necessary. It's not impacting our users too much if pieces of collections are in different locations. So in retrospect, we wouldn't have needed to kind of make that decision early on. Another lesson learned that we should have anticipated, but when you quickly go through and use our minimal standards to go through collections, there's impacts on other areas. This was specifically felt in the government publications area of the library. We were churning through a lot of content, which then gave our government publications librarian a lot of new material to catalog, shelve, and evaluate. And we hadn't planned for any additional staff in that area. And our final lesson learned, and it's what you can see on the screen here, is that we remembered we have a lot of good stuff. One collection that we used MPLP on part of for this project turned out to have the Wisconsin ratification of the 19th Amendment in it. And that's what you can see on screen being worked on here. It had been in a box labeled Secretary of State Miscellaneous since about 1976. And because we were able to use these processes to identify collections and look through them, we were then able to find the Wisconsin ratification copy of the 19th Amendment. And obviously, that particular item got more than MPLP treatment. It was part of a collection that's now been fully processed. And I just wanted to end with a picture of our new building because we're so proud of it. This is our State Archive Preservation Storage Facility. We finished moving in the spring of last year, and we are now working this year to make sure that it is fully operationalized and we're able to bring collections back on a daily basis for our users that need them. And my contact information is on screen, so if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me or ask them in the chat.
Okay, well, thank you, Abbie. We appreciate your presentation, too. And so now we are ready for questions and answers. And so just to remind everyone, if you've got a question for our presenters, go ahead and type it into chat, and we'll relay it to our presenters and hopefully get an answer for you. So the first question I'm going to ask is for Michael. Michael, what would you say was the biggest challenge in implementing the new processing procedures?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we faced was communicating it to all of our staff and bringing them along with us, making sure that everybody understood what it was we were trying to accomplish, making sure that they had an opportunity to provide input into it, and that if they provided feedback, that we answer their feedback. It might not always be the answer that they wanted, but we felt like we really needed to make sure that they had an answer, and continuing that process. So when we initially drafted the processing manual, we went out and met with all the staff. We had staff meetings. I actually ended up traveling around the country and meeting with all of our field unit staff to explain what the processing standards were all about and what we were trying to accomplish, and giving them an opportunity for discussion on that. So really, I think making sure that the staff were, if not in total agreement with what it was, understood what it was all about and where we were trying to go with this, and that they were clear on the processes that were involved, and that they felt like they had an opportunity to have a dialogue about it. And that process has continued with all of our revisions and providing staff an opportunity to provide feedback annually on the processing manual.
Great. Now, this is also on the processing manual. Charles Rogers asked, how many pages are in the processing manual? And then he goes on to ask about training for staff and resistance from staff. So what can you share?
Yeah, so the manual is 44 pages long. It keeps getting longer. I think it started out at about 30 pages or so. So it's definitely gotten longer as we've added more material, but it's 44 pages right now. Training, what I said before about working with the staff really gets to the training piece of it, because a lot of that was training. We have had some efforts to talk to staff about the processes and make sure that they understand what's involved. We're creating new training now for the assessments, which is more formalized training. Resistance, yeah, sure. Any large organization, and this was a major change, so it's not surprising that there was some resistance. I think the majority of people, majority of staff, understood what we were trying to go work towards, and didn't I don't think anybody actively resisted doing this. I think some people didn't agree with what we were trying to do, and that probably reflects the profession as a whole. I think that not everybody agrees with the MPLP approach. I think more people do today than they, maybe 15 years ago, when I remember a lot of very heated discussions about it. But there are still some people that feel like we're shortchanging the records in some cases. But I think everybody is totally on board with doing it, and we continue to have those conversations. Great.
One more question. Again, this is about the the manual. We had a question about if you could share the link or the documents, a link to the 2014 white paper, the policy, and the manual.
Yeah, I'm happy to send the manual to anybody that would like it, and then that does have the policy in the manual. Just people can feel free to email me. I put my email address on the chat, so happy to respond to any emails about that and any other questions or information about our processes you'd like. It's michael.moore@nara.gov.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. Abbie, we have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of this project, what types of collections have seen the biggest increase in use?
The collections that have seen the biggest increase in use are actually our gubernatorial papers. We were able to provide more information for, I think, the last 3 Wisconsin governors. We were able to make their records more accessible, and those have definitely been the most used records out of this project.
All right, great. Well, I don't see any other questions in chat. So again, if you need more information, you can certainly contact the speakers. They'll be happy to work with you individually. Also, Becky has let us know that if you'd like to watch this webinar again, the link will be up on the CoSA website, and you'll be able to watch it or pull up parts of it and see what you may need. Or if someone didn't get to sign on and you think this would be useful, let them know that these recordings are available. So again, we want you to stay connected. So here are the many ways you can stay connected with CoSA. If you go to our website, we have a lot of information, tons and tons of information. And of course, we have a whole page that talks about our programs and webinars. So if you'd like to know about future webinars or signing up for those things, we encourage you to do that. Plus, we have all these other things, Resource Center, Twitter handle, and Facebook page. Of course, NARA would also like you to stay informed. And again, they have a wonderful website, a Twitter handle, a Facebook page, and a social media directory. So make use of all these really great resources. Now might be a good time to get familiar with all of these things, now that you don't have some of the distractions from the office. So we really do appreciate your feedback on these things. So when you leave the webinar today, you'll get a quick evaluation. So do take a couple minutes and answer the questions for us. It really does help us as we put together all of these presentations and come up with new topics for future webinars. So with that, I'd like to thank both of our presenters today, Michael and Abbie. We appreciate you sharing your work on MPLP with us. I'd like to thank everyone who attended today. So thank you for coming. Stay well, and we will see you next time at our next webinar. Have a great one, everyone.